Alright, so welcome to the next episode of Car Plebs. My name is Dick, and today I want to show you and guide you through my fantastic journey of my first DIY with my 996 Porsche 911. So as you may know, I've recently acquired a 996 911, as you can see in the purchase overview, and there has been some things that needed to be done on the car to bring it back to shape prior to sending it to the mechanic. So here we have basically what we're going to focus on today. We have the airbag steering bracket, as mentioned. We have some light bulbs. We have some air filters, both for the cabin air filter as well as for the engine air filter. Basically, I'm not a big fan of cold air intake kits or things like that. I do prefer to stick to the typical panel air filter. And then, of course, we have the gas struts that I've mentioned to in the first preview, that basically the rear hood is being supported by a wiper blade. And last but not least, of course, the intake plenum from IPD. It's a beautiful piece of engineering, I have to say so personally. I like the way it looks, and I think it brings a lot in terms of actual added value in terms of performance. So before we begin, what I would always recommend to do is to disconnect your battery if you keep the car unlocked, just because of the fact that, of course, as you're opening the car, as basically you're doing things on the car, you do have sensors, you do have light bulbs that are constantly on, so you don't want to drain that battery, specifically if it's a car that you do not daily drive. So disconnect the negative terminal first. So let's start with the gas struts on the front hood. So what they're done, they're basically attached with these two retaining clips, which you can see here on the top and on the bottom. One is more hidden from the inside, but nevertheless, basically those are the two clips you want to take off. And what I would recommend is to use a pick screwdriver, or basically a hook screwdriver that can basically help you get inside in that spot between the clip itself and the gas strut itself. And basically as you unclip it, then it's quite easy to detach either of them. Another worthwhile mention is that you might want to have some tape or something like this around, just so that you can basically put that in between the screwdriver and the hood or any piece of metal, just so you don't damage it by chance or scratch the surface. A cool thing about the gas struts that I didn't mention is that the company that produces them is in fact called Stabilus Lieftomat. So we have now successfully replaced the gas struts for the hood, and I think this is the right stage to mention the fact that you want to be prepared for your DIY. So I'm here in a underground garage with limited light sources. I'm actually using a tripod with an iPhone attached to it, serving as the light source. I have only my small carry-on baggage that I'm basically using as my toolkit or mobile repair toolkit, as you can see here, and that's what you don't want to do. And as you'll find out later on in the video, it caused a lot of problems. So yeah, make sure you're prepared. Now what we're going to do is we're going to replace the cabin air filter. As you can see on my example, it looks like it hasn't been replaced in ages. I'm not even sure that the previous two owners knew that there is a filter in this location, because it looks absolutely terrible. On the other hand, given that you're already in this location, what I would recommend to do is to take a look at the battery tray. So there's a metal tray on the bottom or under the battery, and that's connected by usually 4 screws, and you want to unscrew that and clean out that region of the car, because you don't want leaves, dirt, and all of that building up, because that might potentially lead to eventual rust in the near future. So now let's take a good look at what it is that we're actually going to replace. So what we want to replace is the intake plenum itself. So the intake plenum is housed between the intake manifold itself, of course, as well as the throttle body. And I've said this on many occasions, I'm very proud that I have a cable throttle body. And then it's basically connected to the airbox, and between the airbox and the throttle body you do have the mass airflow sensor. As you can see, I do like to pre-spray my screws with WD-40. I think it's a best practice, or at least in my observations it's never caused any harm. So in general, the airbox is held on by approximately 4 screws or so you want to detach those and slowly start to dismount the airbox. Of course, prior to actually taking out the airbox, you want to disconnect the mass air fuel sensor, which is actually just being held on by 2 little clips. So as you press those 2 clips, the cable connector itself should just easily pop off. So given that we're taking out the airbox, I would also recommend to take this moment to actually clean it off. So there was on mine at least a lot of dust buildup, debris, things like that. So I think, this is the right stage where, since it's out anyways, you can just grab, I don't know, some brake clean or some water or some other, let's call it liquid that you have on hand, and just rub it in between the fins. And then really all you need to do is to unscrew the screws holding the top and bottom parts of the airbox itself, and that's where you can find the air filter. So now we've opened the air filter box itself, or the housing I guess, and while I have found some debris in general, some leaves and other things, I have to say it's not in bad condition. I mean, I know that some people would assume that this is terrible, but at the end of the day it's supposed to filter the air, and yes, it's not the shiniest, brightest one, but at the end of the day it still serves its purpose. So as you open up the fins, there aren't any big dislodged pieces or debris. I mean, a few leaves here and there, but again, nothing disastrous or terrible. And now we have installed the BMC Sports Air Filter. So as you can see, it looks much better than the prior one. I have to say I always like the look of the red ones, personal taste. But one thing I would want to mention is the fact that in the older style filters, you had to actually oil up the individual membranes or fins. And in the newer ones, they come pre-oiled. So it doesn't make any sense basically to apply any oil to them. Okay, so we have the airbox outside, we've replaced the filter, so now we can move on to the actual disassembly of the throttle body. So this particular job shouldn't take much time, to be honest, because we have there 4 screws attaching the throttle body to the intake manifold or intake plenum itself. And once you disassemble those 4 screws, there's a hose and there's some other parts. Of course, you have to de-link the cable throttle itself from the cable throttle body. But again, this is something that I have done personally without any instruction manuals or instructions whatsoever, so it wasn't, let's call it, that complicated. So I'll speed up the video now. So in general, the disassembly wasn't that difficult. The one thing that caused a lot of additional time was the fact that the intake plenum is connected to the intake manifold using these 2 oval-shaped hoses, and around those hoses you have clamps. Now, in fact, they are so tight on both sides that despite you loosening them, it leaves little room for what I would call maneuverability of the plenum itself. So in other words, basically to take the plenum out. And because of that, you have to be very careful when wiggling it not to damage the hoses, because we are talking at the end of the day about a car that has 20 plus years, and I can imagine that those hoses are not the, let's call it, the cheapest on the planet. And here we have it. We have taken out the old intake plenum. As you can see, it's made out of plastic and it's rather shaped in the form of a T. So this is actually not causing the most optimal airflow, and hence why the IPD plenum comes into play, because as I've shown previously, it has a V shape, so it should guide the air more smoothly with less turbulence to the actual cylinders themselves. And yeah, so here we have it. The new intake plenum by IPD is already installed, partially at least. So we can take a good gander at the actual structure itself. Again, I have to say the design is fantastic, at least from a visual perspective. And I think we can start reassembling the throttle body and the airbox. One thing to mention is that as you have installed the new intake plenum, you don't want to over tighten or tighten the O-rings or the clamps at all, to be honest, in the beginning, because you need to leave a lot of room for maneuverability, because at the end of the day you're going to be attaching the throttle body, and the throttle body has only one specific height at which the throttle cable attaches it to itself in an optimal way. And with that clack, my whole Saturday just got ruined. As you heard, in that very instance, one of the screws fell down somewhere in the middle of the engine. Now what has happened was I had a long day, I had a few beers in the garage working on the car, and one thing led to another. The screw in fact did fall in somewhere into the engine, one of the screws attaching the throttle body to the intake plenum. For a few seconds there, I really thought, okay, no big deal, I'll just find it on the floor. I looked on the floor, it wasn't there. I looked at the airbox just to make sure that I was looking at the right screws. I looked all over. And after approximately 15 minutes, I realized, yeah, we're having a problem. So I did everything. I looked for the screws on the left, on the right, in between the bumper, the heat shield. I ended up having to disassemble the IPD plenum, the throttle body, all basically to where we started with. And at the end of the day, I still couldn't find it. So at that stage, I was so desperate, I had to call my wife. Honey, please come take a look. I need your skinny hand to feel something up, to feel for the screw. And she didn't find it either. And here I am thinking, oh my God, I'm gonna look like a complete imbecile if I call my mechanic that here I am on a Saturday evening messing with my car and unsuccessfully not repairing it or not repairing the car. So yeah, what can I say? 2 hours later. At the end of it all, really it has taken me 2-3 hours to find the screw. I took pictures of the screw, and I think I'm going to remember this moment for the rest of my life, not for this to ever happen, that here I was, hunky-dory, very happy that I've successfully installed the IPD plenum, to think, oh, assembly, that's gonna be a piece of cake. So I ended up using my iPhone to record with the flash on to see as a last resort whether I can see something. I tried this already 3 times over the course, but finally on the last time I identified the screw, as you can see here. Then I MacGyvered a magnet out of one of the small magnets that I had in my tool case as a bits in the iFixit case, and I fashioned a little line from zip ties to actually dig out the screw, and I ended up digging it out. And I can tell you the joy. I have never in my life been so happy to see one screw as I was at that moment. So the last thing to do was to start up the engine. I was very, very happy to hear that after all of that disassembly and reassembly, everything was fine. So the car started up and we gave it some time basically to warm up a bit. So I gave the car a few minutes so that it actually warms up. Once I saw that the temperature needle moved on the water coolant, then I started giving it some revs, and I immediately noticed a more throatier intake sound or intake noise. But nevertheless, what I wanted to as well check is whether I still have the mass airflow sensor issue. So as you can hear, I'm giving the car full revs. And despite giving it full revs, you can hear a noticeable hesitation. So every single time I rev it right now, I'm giving it 100% throttle, but still there is a lot of hesitation. All right. So that wraps up our first DIY with the 996. It was quite the journey. Nevertheless, I have some key takeaways and personal growth topics. Don't drink too much, make sure you have good lighting, and make sure you bring the right tools. All right, take care, bye-bye.